Chapter 1. The Garden Party, the Village of Farnsfield. Nestled comfortably between the sloping hills of Hampshire and fringed with hawthorn hedges and lavender banks, possessed a curious ability to slow time. Life here unfolded in the most unhurried. Of ways, births, marriages, deaths, and scandals, arriving not with grand fanfare, but with a raised brow or a slight twitch of a lace-gloved hand. In Farnsfield, the real drama happened not in the open, but in whispered asides at the greengrocer's counter, or behind lowered voices over cups of milky tea. It was a warm June afternoon, with the sun drawing golden veins across the petals of well-manicured rose bushes, and Miss Lavinia Crowthorne's garden was in full bloom both florally and socially. The annual garden party at the Laurels had, over the years, become something of a village tradition. To be invited was to be included. To attend was to be seen. Miss Crowthorne herself, a tall, angular woman with the imperious bearing of a retired opera singer, though she had never sung publicly in her life, presided over the affair like a duchess at court, hearing through her lorgnette and issuing greetings with a regal nod. A string quartet, hired from the nearby town of Bexley, performed from a shady nook near the gazebo. The air was thick with the mingled scents of sweet peas, raspberry jam, and the faint, cloying perfume of lavender sachets tucked into elderly ladies' handbags. China clinked gently against saucers. Teaspoons stirred. Conversation floated lazily. On the breeze, Miss Jane Marple, seated beneath a striped parasol near the lilac hedge, observed the gathering with quiet curiosity. Dressed in a soft dove-gray ensemble with a matching hat, her appearance was as unassuming as always. In one hand she held a plate of Battenberg cake, in the other a cup of Darjeeling, her pale blue eyes sharp, bird-like, and deceptively gentle-roamed. Over the crowd, with the ease of someone accustomed to seeing far more than people believed she saw, she watched as Mrs. Gladys Crabtree adjusted her far too large sun hat and leaned in toward Mr. Pettigrew, a rotund, retired solicitor whose tweed jacket seemed wholly unsuited to the warmth of the day. Mr. Denholm's taken in a new housekeeper, Mrs. Crabtree said in a stage whisper. A widow from Brighton, no less, Mrs. Elspeth Grant, a little too polished, if you ask me. Never trust a woman who wears silk to mop floors. Decorative, certainly, Mr. Pettigrew muttered, eyes following the aforementioned Mrs. Grant across the lawn. Bit too decorative for domestic work, I dare say. But Denholm was never one to make decisions with his head. Miss Marple smiled, though her attention was already drifting. There, near the shaded terrace where the refreshments were laid, stood the focal group of the day, Mr. Arthur Denholm, the village's prosperous and perpetually red-faced coal merchant, was speaking animatedly to the Reverend Hargraves. Denholm, dressed in a too-tight waistcoat, had the manner of a man who enjoyed being listened to more than he enjoyed listening. Hargraves, tall and silver-haired, with a tendency to blink nervously when caught off guard, nodded politely while glancing now and then toward his wife, who was in deep conversation with Miss Sylvia Trimble. Miss Trimble, the schoolmistress, had the kind of anxious energy that made one feel perpetually behind schedule. Her mouse-brown hair was pinned severely, and she wore a plain frock of dusty green that did her sallow complexion no favors. She clutched a tea saucer as though it might suddenly be snatched from her, and her thin lips twitched each time someone mentioned Mrs. Grant. Leonard Fielding stood not far off, hands in his pockets, watching them all with a distant expression. Having recently returned from London, where he worked at a bank, Leonard was considered something of a catch. Tall, handsome, and unhurried in his movements, he seemed both familiar and faintly unreachable, like a novel one had once begun but never finished. There had been murmurs, of course, about his past, some whispered of financial troubles, others of a quiet dismissal from his post, but nothing was ever confirmed that Mrs. Elspeth Grant, the newest addition to Farnsfield's social landscape, floated among them like cream and tea. She was elegant, composed, and most dangerously amiable. Her silver blonde hair was pinned in a French chignon, and her pale pink dress fit perfectly, neither showy nor shy. She laughed lightly at Denholm's jokes, handed the vicar's wife a fresh plate of cucumber sandwiches, and complimented Miss Trimble's brooch in a tone so sincere it made the schoolmistress blush. "She does know how to work a room," murmured Miss Marple to no one in particular. It was at the height of this genteel hum of social exchange that the clatter came. It was sharp, abrupt, breaking the music like a dish shattering on stone. Heads turned. The quartet ceased playing mid-dash waltz. Mrs. Elspeth Grant was standing stock still near the center table, her cup falling in slow motion, its porcelain cracking into delicate shards against the brickwork below. Her hands were splayed in front of her as though she had expected to catch something, but found nothing. Her eyes went wide. Then, without so much as a word, she crumpled to the ground, collapsing with the grace of someone who had once danced but could no longer keep time. Gasps rippled like a wind through the hedges. "She's fainted." No, someone fetch Dr. Pembroke. From the far corner, a portly man with thinning hair and a bright red carnation in his lapel pushed forward. Dr. Bernard Pembroke, the village's general practitioner, knelt beside the woman, pulling a stethoscope from his breast pocket and issuing calm instructions to clear the area. Miss Marple did not move toward the fallen figure. Instead, she rose quietly, setting her teacup gently on the armrest of her chair. Her eyes scanned the immediate area, not in alarm, but with practiced scrutiny. The tea table bore 6 cups, now in disarray. Only one had been disturbed, Mrs. Grant's, a single rose-painted cup, broken into 3 perfect pieces. On one of them, a smudge of coral lipstick. "No insect sting," Dr. Pembroke muttered, adjusting his spectacles. "No visible trauma. Good Lord, she's gone cold. Dead?" Miss Trimble shrieked. Pembroke didn't answer at once, but the look on his face made the answer clear enough. "Call Constable Farrow," someone cried, quickly. Miss Lavinia Crowthorne, her usually impeccable composure slipping, turned to her maid. "Mildred, the telephone." As the crowd murmured and circled, Miss Marple remained at the edge, watching with the quiet attention of someone who had seen too much of death to be surprised by its timings. She stepped lightly toward the refreshment table, noting the untouched sandwich on Mrs. Grant's plate, one bite taken from a shortbread biscuit, a half-eaten strawberry tart, and the tea still steaming faintly, though now shattered on the stones. Something about the scene struck her, not the drama of it, but the precision. Poison, if poison, it was required delivery, and tea was the most common vessel. Miss Marple glanced at the others. Mr. Denholm was redder than usual, blinking hard and breathing through his mouth. Sylvia Trimble looked faint. Leonard Fielding had stepped back, his hand covering his lips. Reverend Hargraves was praying under his breath. "Poor woman," someone murmured behind her. "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, "but what a very curious moment for her to die." And with that, the gentle whir of conversation so ever present at garden parties dissolved entirely. The garden had fallen silent. Even the birds, as if sensing some great breach of natural order, had gone still. In the hedges, where moments before there had been gossip and gossipers, now there was only the sudden, chilling certainty that something awful had intruded. A woman lay dead on the lawn. Beneath fluttering bunting and wilting roses, her teacup shattered beside her, and standing quietly among them, unnoticed by most, was Miss Marple watching. Thinking dot as ever, it began with tea. Chapter 2. The village reacts news in Farnsfield traveled with the speed and tenacity of a thistle in the wind. By the time the constable arrived, his bicycle propped awkwardly against the Crowthorns' garden gate, the entire village had already heard that Mrs. Elspeth Grant had collapsed and died during Miss Lavinia's garden party, clutching a teacup as though it were her final possession on earth. By dusk, the shutters of the high street shops had been drawn slightly tighter than usual, and lamps in parlors glowed with a more conspiratorial light. Inside kitchens and drawing rooms, conversations buzzed with the hunger of mystery newly born. "She went down like a felled poplar, they say," muttered old Mr. Sharp at the tobacconist's, puffing on a pipe as he recounted the event for the third time in as many hours. "Poison. That's what my cousin says," said his wife, Ruth, "and she's a nurse's aide in Market Welling. Said it were arsenic, clear as day. Sudden collapse, no struggle. Straight out of the textbook. No struggle because she were enjoying herself too much," someone else chimed in. "Smiling and laughing right to the end, that one." "She'd barely been in the village a month," said Miss Agnes Birch, who ran the sweet shop and had watched Mrs. Grant pick out barley sugar just last Tuesday. "It's always the newcomers, isn't it? Either the ones doing the dying or the killing." In the parsonage, Reverend Hargraves sat heavily in his study, nursing a brandy and replaying the event in his mind. He'd spoken to Elspeth only moments before her collapse. She'd complimented his sermon, lightly teased him about his Latin pronunciation, and mentioned something vague about starting a reading group at the church hall. Now she was dead, and the police were already suggesting foul play. At the Laurels, Miss Lavinia Crowthorne had abandoned all pretense of composure and was pacing her drawing room in a state of high dudgeon. "It's simply monstrous," she declared to her sister-in-law Eugenia, who'd arrived after hearing the gossip from the fishmonger. "In the middle of my garden party. Do you know how long it took Mildred to press those tablecloths, and the lemon curd made by hand?" "She's dead, Lavinia," Eugenia said firmly. "Surely the tablecloths can wait." Miss Crowthorne gave her a hard look. "You don't understand. This sort of thing lingers. Death has a way of clinging to a reputation. They'll be whispering about this for years." At the vicarage, Sylvia Tremble sat with a cup of cocoa untouched in her lap. Her fingers trembled, not from the evening chill, but from something deeper, an unsettled awareness. She had disliked Elspeth Grant. Oh, not openly. But there had been something about her, the way she smiled at the menfolk, the quickness of her wit, the quiet confidence of someone who knew they were being watched and enjoyed it. "I suppose we'll all be questioned," she murmured aloud. Though no one else was in the room Miss Marple, meanwhile, had retired to her neat little cottage on St. Mary's Lane, where the fire crackled cheerfully and a small brass kettle whistled on the hob. She stirred a cup of cocoa, adding just a whisper of nutmeg, and sat in her favorite chair by the window. Outside, the sky was an indigo hush, and the moon hung full and fat like a pearl. She hadn't said much at the scene. She rarely did not. At first, but she had seen everything worth seeing. The hesitation in Leonard Fielding's step when he looked down at the body. The way Mr. Denholm had pocketed a handkerchief hastily, as though wiping something away. The flicker of panic instantly, suppressed in Miss Trimble's pinched expression. None of it meant guilt. Not yet. But all of it meant something. A murder, if that's what it was, had to come from somewhere. Motive, opportunity, method, yes, but even more telling was why now. Why here, at this party? Miss Marple had learned over the years that people rarely did things without reason. Even when they claimed spontaneity, there was always a story beneath the story. And stories, she thought, sipping her cocoa, were what villages were made of. The next morning dawned with a deceptive calm. Dew clung to the roses. Sparrows chirped as if nothing in the world had changed. But change had crept into Farnsfield, quiet and cold. The police had set up a temporary post in the reading room of the parish hall, and Sergeant Cornisha, capable, if uninspired officer, was taking statements from guests who'd been at the garden party. Miss Trimble sat stiffly on a wooden chair, her hands clenched in her lap. She smiled at me, she said. Mrs. Grant, I mean. Just before, a strange sort of smile, as if she knew something. I didn't like it. Had you quarreled with her? Cornish asked, scribbling. No. Sylvia's eyes went wide. No, of course not. We weren't exactly close. She was different, not like the rest of us. Always seemed to know just the thing to say to turn heads. And you felt threatened by that? Miss Trimble stiffened. I'm a schoolteacher, Sergeant. I don't concern myself with frivolities. Across the village, Mr. Denholm answered the constable's questions with impatient bluster. I barely knew the woman, he snapped. She cleaned, she cooked. End of story. Look, it's a tragedy. I'll grant you that. But people die all the time. Stroke, heart failure, why jump to murder? Because Dr. Pembroke's examination was inconclusive, the constable said mildly. And because no one collapses like that without cause. Denholm glowered. I didn't poison anyone, if that's what you're insinuating. Later that day, Leonard Fielding visited Miss Marple's garden under the pretense of returning a borrowed copy of Great Expectations. He looked pale more than usual, and his usual calm was frayed at the edges. She asked me to meet her, he said quietly, after Miss Marple invited him for tea. Elspeth? Miss Marple tilted her head. When? Just before the party. She said she wanted to talk privately. Something about needing advice, but she never told me what it was about. Miss Marple poured tea into delicate cups, the kind with violets on the rims. And were you involved with her, Mr. Fielding? Leonard flushed. No, nothing like that. She was charming, I suppose, but I barely knew her. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. Strange, isn't it? For someone to seek advice from a stranger. Or perhaps she didn't see you as a stranger. He didn't answer. That night, as church bells tolled softly in the distance and the village prepared for an uneasy sleep, Miss Marple opened a small notebook. In it she wrote 3 names, Sylvia Trimble Arthur Denholm Leonard Fielding, beside them. A 4th, Elspeth Grant, deceased then, underneath a neat looping script. A murder among strangers is rare. Among neighbors, never. She closed the notebook. Outside an owl hooted. Somewhere someone knew what had happened in the garden. That day Miss Marple intended to find out who. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The next morning began with a gray drizzle hanging over Farnsfield like a damp shroud, soaking the hedgerows and muting the vibrant colors of June. The village, so recently bathed in sunlight and laughter, now seemed quiet or watchful. No one lingered at the grocer's. The postmistress sorted letters with unusually tight lips. Even the baker's bell rang with a subdued tone, as if morning had worked its way into the bricks and mortar. Constable Farrell, a broad-shouldered man with a perpetually apologetic mustache, stood stiffly on the crowthorn garden path, speaking with Sergeant Cornish beside the flower-bed where Mrs. Grant had fallen. The doctor's preliminary findings had been frustratingly vague. Possible poisoning, yes, but no overt trace without laboratory confirmation. No wounds, no marks. It wasn't natural, certainly, but neither was it obvious. T's the likeliest, Cornish muttered, squinting through the drizzle. She'd taken but a few sips, broke the cup when she dropped. Farrell scratched his chin. Might have been hers, might have been someone else's. Exactly, Cornish said grimly. If someone meant to poison her, they either handed her that cup directly, or they hoped she'd be the one to pick it up. That means either a very precise hand or a very careless one. Inside her parlor on St. Mary's Lane, Miss Marple was methodically polishing her silver teaspoons while listening to the wireless murmuring softly in the background. She wasn't one for over-polishing. Mind you, it was simply a habit that helped her think. People were always quick to talk after a death. The key was knowing how they talked. In the village, guilt never appeared where you expected it. People covered shame with duty, deflected grief with gossip, and explained motive away with the word unthinkable, as if that ever meant anything. Her mind drifted to Sylvia Trimble. There had been a tenseness in the schoolteacher's posture that went beyond shock. Not quite grief, no, something else. Resentment, perhaps. And Leonard Fielding, his unfinished sentence during tea yesterday, still hung in the air. She wanted advice. That meant she feared something. Or someone. Miss Marple took out a folded newspaper from the drawer beside her armchair. The Farnsfield Gazette, freshly delivered, bore the headline in neat block print: Tragedy at Garden Party, Sudden Death of Mrs. Elspeth Grant. Prompts. I know known names were named beyond the deceased and Miss Crowthorne as hostess, but the undercurrent of speculation was palpable. Miss Marple smiled to herself. The real clues were never in the ink. They were in the silences between words. Just after noon, she paid a visit to the vicarage. "I hope I'm not intruding, Reverend," she said with her usual delicate warmth, umbrella dripping politely on the mat. "Miss Marple, not at all," Hargraves said, stepping aside. "You're always welcome." He looked older than he had a week ago, his temples grayer, the lines around his eyes more furrowed. She was shown to the sitting room, where he joined her with a pot of tea and a furrowed brow. "I keep wondering if I missed something," he confessed, pouring for them both. "Elspeth was perfectly calm when we spoke. Gracious, really. She even asked about the charity raffle. Said she had something she wanted to contribute, to make an impression, she said. Miss Marple tilted her head. Did she say what that something was? No. He shook his head. But I got the impression it was important. Personal, perhaps. Miss Marple stirred her tea. She was a widow, I understand. But I gather there was some confusion about her background? Hargraves looked momentarily uncomfortable. Well, there were rumors, naturally. She'd only been in the village a short time. Moved into Denholm's cottage after his last housekeeper left rather suddenly. But some said she'd lived under another name before. There was talk of an incident in Brighton. Miss Marple nodded slowly. It's always Brighton, isn't it? The Reverend gave a weak smile. Back in the village, Sylvia Trimble was pacing the schoolroom between rows of empty desks. Her lesson plans for the afternoon sat untouched. Her thoughts were elsewhere. Elspeth Grant had been clever, too clever. She remembered the way the woman had complimented her brooch during the garden party. That garnet pin had belonged to her mother, rarely worn, and Elspeth had recognized it in an instant. Victorian mourning jewelry, isn't it? Such pieces often hold family secrets. Sylvia hadn't replied. She hadn't known how Dot was that just idle chatter? Or had she known something? Sylvia didn't realize she was trembling until she heard the knock at the door. Dot, Miss Marple, framed, neatly in the doorway, gave her a gentle smile. I hope I'm not interrupting, Miss Trimble. I wondered if I might trouble you for a word. Inside they spoke in the modest staff office over tea and custard creams. Miss Trimble's nervous hands fussed with the tin lid far too long. You were quite close to Mrs. Grant, weren't you? Miss Marple asked gently. I wouldn't say close. Sylvia swallowed. We spoke, certainly, but she had a way about her. Charming, yes, but also intrusive. She liked to pry. What do you suppose she was looking for? Sylvia hesitated, then whispered, leverage. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the silence do its work. I think she enjoyed holding information, Sylvia added. She'd smile, make a comment, drop a name, as if testing you. I often wondered what she knew about me, about anyone. Miss Marple leaned back. A woman like that rarely dies without leaving someone frightened behind. Sylvia paled, her fingers still on the tin. I didn't do anything, she said quickly. I couldn't have. I don't even like tea. Miss Marple didn't press further. She merely smiled, thanked her for the chat, and excused herself. By evening, the drizzle had cleared. A hush settled over the village again, but it was the hush of held breath, not peace. At her writing desk, Miss Marple made a fresh note in her journal. Elspeth had leverage. Someone had something to lose. Tea is the vehicle, but who prepared this tray? She underlined the last line twice. There was still so much to discover. Who had handled the cups? Who had known where Elspeth would sit? Who had a reason recent or long buried to wish her dead? Miss Marple's eyes drifted to her lace curtains fluttering in the breeze. Farnsfield was quiet tonight, yes, but only on the surface. In its stillness, something was stirring. Chapter 4. First suspects. The inquest had not yet been scheduled, but already Sergeant Cornish had his eyes on a suspect. That much was clear to anyone who overheard him speaking in the Red Hart that evening, his voice lowered but loud enough to stir the embers of village gossip. Denholm, if you ask me, he said, tapping the rim of his half-pint with a sausage-like finger. Too fast to deny everything. Too calm about a dead woman in his parlor. Across the bar, a pair of local farmers exchanged a knowing glance. By nightfall, the entire lane between the bakery and the post office was alive with speculation. Arthur Denholm was a man used to being in charge of men, money, and matters both public and private. He was not, however, used to being questioned. When Sergeant Cornish arrived the next morning for a formal conversation, he found Denholm in his garden, pruning roses with methodical precision. "I won't have this business dragging my name through the mud," Denholm snapped, wiping his shears clean as the sergeant approached. The woman was a housekeeper. "A good one, nothing more. You won't pin this on me." Cornish, not easily cowed, merely opened his notebook. "You had a professional relationship with Mrs. Grant, but the arrangement was rather informal, wasn't it?" "No contract, no reference letters," Denholm grunted. "She needed a place. I had a house too big for myself. It was mutually beneficial. She cooked, she cleaned, and she knew how to fold a shirt properly. That's more than I can say for the last one. But she also dined with you regularly, joined you at church, accompanied you to the garden party." Denholm's face reddened. "What are you insinuating?" "That it wasn't just a professional arrangement." Silence settled between them like fog. Finally, Denholm exhaled through his nose. "She was pleasant company, but she had ambitions, Sergeant. Talked about starting her own dress shop. Wanted an investor. Thought I might be useful. Perhaps I was being played for a fool. But if you're looking for motive, I suggest you find out who else she approached with her little schemes." Cornish closed his notebook. Denholm had a temper, yes, but it was controlled. Too controlled. Meanwhile, Leonard Fielding had quietly left the village that morning on the early train to Bexley. Word had it he had urgent business to tend to at his old bank. But in truth, several noticed how nervous he looked at the station, glancing over his shoulder, clutching his case too tightly. Miss Marple, sipping her tea from the corner bench near the ticket office, had noticed by the time she returned home. She had formed a thought, not a conclusion, mind you, but the beginning of a suspicion. She fetched her needlework and walked to the vicarage, where she'd promised to help the Reverend's wife mend altar linens for Sunday service. Mrs. Hargraves, a round, cheery woman who managed the social life of the parish with military efficiency, offered her a biscuit before launching into the latest whispers. "They say Leonard Fielding may have known her from before," she said, lowering her voice to the cadence of a confession. "Not just from the village, from Brighton. Isn't that curious?" Miss Marple, threading a needle, didn't blink. "Oh, yes, quite. He's such a nice young man," Mrs. Hargraves added hastily, as if trying to convince herself. "But there's something distant about him. You know what I mean?" Miss Marple did know. Leonard Fielding wore his handsomeness like a shield, appealing, but impersonal. One always felt he was watching a second conversation beneath the first. She filed the thought away and asked lightly, "Did Elspeth seem uneasy lately?" Mrs. Hargraves pursed her lips. "Well, now you mention it, yes. I'd invited her to help with the church raffle planning, and she hesitated. Said she had other matters, private ones. I thought it strange at the time, as if she feared putting herself too close to people." At that moment a sharp knock came at the vicarage door. It was Sergeant Cornish. "Forgive the interruption." he said with a polite nod. "Miss Marple, might I have a word?" In the garden, beneath the dripping honeysuckle arch, he spoke low. "You've a better eye for people than most," he admitted. "So I'll speak frankly. I've got 2 names on my desk, both plausible. Denholm for obvious reasons, and Fielding because it turns out he was dismissed from his post at Lloyd's. Some money gone astray. Nothing proven, but enough smoke to raise the question." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And Mrs. Grant knew?" "Quite possibly. We found a note torn in half in her coat pocket, addressed only with L, signed E. Something about arrangements no longer possible. Fielding's first name is Leonard." "A break-off?" Miss Marple asked. "Could be, or a warning." She nodded slowly, watching a bee alight on a peony blossom. "Do you know, Sergeant, there was a remarkable fuss over those teacups at the party. Miss Lavinia had insisted they match the original Georgian pattern blue rose on cream, with a golden rim. She had her maid Mildred polish and arrange them just so. Every guest had a numbered napkin and corresponding place, except, of course, for the people standing near the terrace. Those took from the second tray." Cornish blinked. "And Mrs. Grant? She was one of the terrace guests. So was Sylvia Trimble and Leonard Fielding. I believe there were 5 cups on that tray. One of them is now broken. The others still intact. One was returned half-drunk. 2 were untouched." Cornish stared. "You think it was in the tea?" Miss Marple's face was unreadable. "I think if someone wished to poison a person discreetly, there are far worse opportunities than a distracted gathering. And if one meant to kill Mrs. Grant specifically, one must have known which cup would be hers." Cornish narrowed his eyes. "That takes planning." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but murder usually does." That evening, as twilight drew soft shadows across Farnsfield's lanes, Miss Marple took a slow walk past the old parish hall. Her steps led her to a wooden bench, where she sat beneath the gas lamp and watched moths spiral upward like sparks. From a dying fire dot in her reticule, she carried 3 things: a folded linen napkin marked with the number 4, a dried hydrangea blossom with the faintest stain on its petal, and a page torn from an old parish newsletter, a list of names Elspeth. Grant had circled in red ink. Each name had something in common. Each one had something to lose. Chapter 5. A hidden clue the next morning broke clear and bright, as if to mock the unease curling beneath Farnsfield's orderly surface. A veil had fallen over the village, thin but inescapable. Behind every polite exchange at the butcher's counter or every cheerful greeting on the lane, there was a pause, a hesitation. People were not themselves, though they clung to routine as if it could ward off the shadow now hovering over them. Miss Marple, for her part, had never believed much in coincidence. She sat at her writing desk, reviewing a modest collection of notes, which included napkin numbers, teacup placements, and the subtle order in which guests had arrived at the garden party. But one line, scrawled almost absently the previous evening, stood out in her own neat hand: hydrangea petal, stained, not with tea. She removed the blossom from her pressed notes folder and studied it again in the morning light. A faint reddish smear ran across one of the petals, dried now, but unmistakably not the color of Darjeeling. Too bright, too artificial dot. Miss Marple had seen something like it before. Not recently, but long ago, in a very different context, during a Women's Institute meeting in St. Mary Mead, when a particularly bold milliner had given a demonstration on hat dyes. She had shown the ladies how one could refresh old ribbons using a concentrated blend of powdered cochineal and vinegar. A single drop, the woman had said, and it'll stain your fingertips pink for days. Miss Marple took out her compact and gently dabbed a wet cloth to the edge of the petal. The red bloomed again, faint but definite. It wasn't from the tea. Someone had spilled something else near the teacups, or into them. She reached for her hat and gloves. The Crowthorne household was abuzz when Miss Marple arrived, as it often was in the days after Lavinia's garden parties, though rarely under such circumstances. Miss Crowthorne herself was in the parlor, surrounded by fabric swatches, reviewing ideas for a new set of cushioned covers with her sister-in-law, Eugenia, as if redecorating could bleach away the scandal. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said briskly, when the maid announced her, "I do hope you haven't come to discuss that dreadful woman's demise. I've just recovered from the shock." "I wouldn't dream of disturbing your peace, Lavinia," Miss Marple replied with a pleasant smile. "But I did have a small question, Will, more of a curiosity, really." Lavinia raised an eyebrow. "Yes? I was wondering about the tea service. That second tray, was it prepared in your kitchen or delivered from the caterer's van?" "Oh, from my own kitchen, of course," Lavinia said proudly. "Mildred handled it. I insist on supervising the tea myself. Caterers always oversteep the Darjeeling, and the china tray well, that belonged to my mother. I wouldn't trust it to strangers. Mildred served it?" "She did, carried it out, personally. But it was Sylvia Trimble who passed it round. Said she'd help so Mildred could attend to the cake table." Miss Marple nodded. "And were the cups already poured?" "No, no," said Eugenia, glancing up. "Just the teapot, milk jug, sugar bowl, and empty cups." Miss Marple thanked them kindly and left a few minutes later, her thoughts arranging themselves as neatly as her needle-point threads. Sylvia Trimble had poured the tea. An anxious woman. Repressed, tightly wound. Not overtly cruel. But Miss Marple had seen before how the pressure of secrets could warp a soul. Sylvia had known Elspeth for only a short time, yet their interactions had already crackled with hidden meaning. But no, it didn't feel quite right. Sylvia didn't strike her as deliberate enough for poisoning. Not unless provoked. Not unless cornered. Miss Marple stopped by the parish hall, where the Women's League was hosting a morning charity drive. She found Mrs. Crabtree folding second-hand linens with visible relish. "Goodness, Jane," she said as Miss Marple approached, "the talk about town could fill a whole season of the Strand magazine. Between the inquest and the tea, I'd say. Half the village is planning their own funerals in case someone offers them a drink." Miss Marple smiled. "I do find it fascinating how quickly people form conclusions. I've even heard Elspeth's death linked to a dressmaker's dispute in Brighton." Mrs. Crabtree leaned in. "Oh, yes. My cousin Myra's friend knew someone at the boarding house where Elspeth stayed. Apparently there was a row money owed, tempers flared, and some man involved, naturally." "Always a man," Miss Marple murmured. "Did they say who?" "No name, but someone clever. Financial, perhaps. There's a feeling she left Brighton not to start anew, but to escape something." Escape, yes, that made sense. Miss Marple returned home, her mind circling back to the hydrangea stain. She fetched the linen napkin again. Number 4, and examined the hem. A fine dust clung to the edge. Not sugar, not powder, something grainy. She brushed a bit onto white paper, dabbed it with water, and watched as it turned the faintest rose pink. Lip rouge? No, rouge wouldn't stain that way. This was something else. She paused. Cochineal, a natural dye. Bright red, bitter if consumed in any quantity, and occasionally used centuries ago as a base for certain tinctures. She flipped through her old copy of The Domestic Herbalist, and there it was, in small print. Cochineal, when improperly distilled, may cause extreme cardiac distress in susceptible persons. Should not be ingested without dilution. Her mind clicked into place. It wasn't the tea alone. Someone had added something to Mrs. Grant's cup, either in haste or with precision. But cochineal on its own wasn't fatal. It required concentration. A tincture. Miss Marple remembered seeing a tiny bottle fall from a guest's handbag at the party, a moment she dismissed until now. Mrs. Grant had touched something, or someone had handled her cup before she drank. The next morning, Sergeant Cornish visited Miss Marple with fresh news. "We found something strange," he said, during a sweep of Mrs. Grant's room at Denholm's cottage. Hidden behind a loose floorboard. He placed the object on her kitchen table, a small journal wrapped in a faded handkerchief. The first page read, "Names to remember. Promises made. Leverage must be preserved. If anything happens, these must be found." Below it, 3 names. Leonard Fielding Sylvia, tremble at D. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She turned the page. Pressed between the leaves was a scrap of paper. A receipt from Brighton. A purchased tincture of carmine. She folded the handkerchief carefully. The clue had been small, nearly forgotten. A stain on a petal. A smear no one else had seen. But now it was enough to open a door. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The discovery of Mrs. Grant's journal changed everything. Though only a few pages long, it hinted at something far larger than tea and gossip. It suggested a history, a quiet campaign of observation, manipulation, perhaps even blackmail. Names listed plainly, no explanation. And yet the tone was unmistakable. If anything happens, Elspeth had known she was playing with fire. Within 24 hours, Sergeant Cornish had summoned each of the named parties, Leonard Fielding, Sylvia Trimble, and Arthur Denholm, for further questioning at the parish hall. Miss Marple, of course, had not been asked to attend, but the vicar's wife had quite naturally invited her to supervise the flower arrangements on the chancel table that very same morning, giving her an unobstructed view of every arrival and exit through the churchyard path. From her perch among the lily, Miss Marple noted each subtle expression as the suspects filed in. Leonard Fielding arrived first, looking pale but composed, his hands tucked too carefully into the pockets of his linen coat. He paused at the door, blinked once, and then squared his shoulders before stepping inside. Sylvia Trimble came next, accompanied by the scent of gardenia and an anxious expression. Her usual stiff posture was sharper than ever, her spine a rod of ice. She clutched a brown leather handbag as though it contained her last defense. Arthur Denholm followed nearly half an hour later, lumbering up the steps with forced indifference. He greeted no one, offered a curt nod to the constable at the door, and went straight inside. But even from where she sat, Miss Marple could see his jaw was clenched. By noon, murmurs rippled through the village again. What's this about a diary? Heavens, a black book like one of those scandal sheets. They say Mrs. Grant had secrets, real secrets. In the minds of Farnsfield's residents, the story had already outpaced the facts. The woman wasn't simply murdered. No, she was punished. For what precisely, no one knew. But in small towns, lack of evidence never prevents a firm opinion. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the schoolhouse. Sylvia Trimble was in her office, sitting behind her desk with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had turned white. A small cup of now cold tea sat beside a pile of unmarked arithmetic papers. "Miss Marple," she said, with a pinched smile, "I assume you're here to discuss everything." "I hope you might help me understand it," Miss Marple replied, gently taking the chair opposite her. Elspeth Grant was a stranger to us, yet she seemed to know quite a lot about everyone. Sylvia's mouth twitched. "She made it her business to know. Did she approach you about your brother?" Sylvia's head snapped up, eyes flashing. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Your brother James. He served time in 1938, did he not? For falsifying public accounts in Sussex. The matter was buried locally, never reached the national press. But Elspeth Grant was from Brighton, and she worked briefly for the same municipal records office." Sylvia's voice dropped to a whisper. "How do you know that?" "I remember things," Miss Marple said simply. Elspeth came to Farnsfield with more than just linens in her suitcase. She carried knowledge, selective knowledge, and she used it to test the waters, to see who would squirm. Sylvia lowered her head. "She asked me for help. Said she needed references, character statements. Said it would look better for her business proposal. I refused. Told her she was meddling in things she didn't understand. But I never harmed her, Miss Marple. I swear to you," Miss Marple nodded, "fear is a powerful thing. But not all fear leads to violence." Sylvia looked away. Her hands had begun to tremble again. Later that evening, Miss Marple took tea with Reverend Hargraves and his wife. The conversation turned, as it inevitably would, to Arthur Denholm. "He's been under pressure," the Reverend said cautiously. "More than people know. Money trouble?" Miss Marple asked. Hargraves hesitated. "Something like that. I can't say too much, of course. He's one of our largest donors to the repairs fund, but he missed his last 2 pledges. There's talk he overextended on a warehouse investment in Eastbourne. Quiet panic. And when panic mixes with pride," Mrs. Hargraves added, "he was sweet on Elspeth, I think. Not publicly, but you could tell. A man like that doesn't often meet someone who treats him with wit. She flattered him. He enjoyed it." "But flattery," Miss Marple murmured, "is a dangerous currency. It depreciates quickly if you don't pay your debts." The vicar's wife raised an eyebrow. "You think she threatened to expose him?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "I think she pressed on wounds she didn't understand, and some wounds bleed faster than others." 2 days later, a quiet confrontation unfolded in the reading room of the parish library. Miss Marple invited Leonard Fielding to meet her under the guise of donating books for the community shelf. He arrived looking wary, his jacket crisply pressed, his smile brittle. "I must say, Miss Marple, I didn't expect your involvement to be so Direct. "Oh, I'm not involved," she replied, selecting a volume of Thackeray for dusting. "Merely observant. Like you." He stiffened. "Elspeth once told me she'd left London because of a mistake she couldn't afford to repeat." "Do you suppose she meant you?" Leonard blinked. "That's quite an accusation." "I make no accusations, Miss Marple," said gently. "But I know the signs of a man who's run from something, or someone. The late hours, the borrowed funds, the clever avoidance of detail. And she, Elspeth, was no fool. If she had discovered your past, your little indiscretions with investor accounts, well, she might have believed you owed her a future in return." Leonard's mouth flattened. "She suggested I fund her shop," he said finally. "Something small. Haberdashery said I needed a fresh start as much as she did, but I said no. I told her I wouldn't risk anything again, that I was finished with schemes." "And then she died," Miss Marple said quietly. Leonard's voice dropped. "I didn't kill her." "I believe you," she said. He looked up, surprised. "You do?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "Yes, because a man who panics doesn't linger at the scene. And you, Mr. Fielding, stood very still beside the rhododendrons, as though you'd seen it coming but hadn't stopped it." For a long moment they said nothing. Then Leonard stood, thanked her, and left. Miss Marple watched him go, her thoughts shifting again. Fielding had been close, but not quite. Something else had moved through the crowd that day, quiet and swift, and someone else had seen the chance to act. That night she reviewed her journal once more. She added new lines beneath the names: Sylvia Fear, Legacy, Family Shame. Denholm, Debt, Pride, Possible Rejection, Fielding, Secrets, Self-Preservation, Elspeth, A Woman with Too Many Keys, and no locks left to open. And beneath it she wrote, not who hated her, but who needed her silence the most, and who had access to the tea. She stared at the sentence for some time, her eyes narrowing. Something was still missing, but not for long. Chapter 7. Another twist. 2 days had passed since the last round of questioning, and though the air in Farnsfield had grown lighter, the villagers were still suspended in unease. The talk at the bakery had turned toward summer fairs and plum harvests again, but there was an unnatural restraint to the conversations, as though everyone was keeping a weather eye out for lightning on a clear day. Miss Marple, however, knew better than to mistake stillness for peace. The first break in the quiet came shortly before vespers on a Friday evening. A second woman collapsed. It happened not in a garden, but in the small back kitchen of the vicarage. Mildred, the maid from the Laurels, had been assisting with flower arrangements for the church altar, and had asked Reverend Hargraves for a quick cup of tea before returning home. Moments later, her tray slipped from her hands, shattering on the stone floor. She gasped, staggered, and gripped the edge of the countertop. Her breathing grew shallow. Her pulse thudded visibly beneath her collarbone. She did not die, but only narrowly by the time Dr. Pembroke arrived. She was shivering beneath a knitted shawl and drifting in and out of lucidity. Her first coherent words were, "It tasted sweet but wrong." The Reverend sent word to Sergeant Cornish at once. An emergency meeting was convened in the vestry, with the sergeant, Dr. Pembroke, Reverend Hargraves, and Miss Marple invited at the vicar's insistence. Cornish paced the narrow room. Another cup. Another collapse. It can't be coincidence. The tea must be the link. But who would poison Mildred? Reverend Hargraves asked, clearly disturbed. She's a maid, for heaven's sake. Dr. Pembroke, stooping beside. The hearth added gravely, I had her stomach pumped immediately. Preliminary results suggest a strong alkaloid, most likely digitalis. Bitter by itself, but masked with enough sugar. Well, Miss Marple's eyes flickered. Digitalis, she echoed softly. The foxglove, commonly found in English gardens, lethal in the right dose, and perfectly natural-looking when dried and powdered. The kind of thing that could be mistaken for kitchen herbs by anyone not paying attention, or perhaps more chillingly, used with full intention. Cornish ran a hand through his hair. We'll need to review every person who's been in or near the kitchens in the last 48 hours. Miss Marple didn't answer. Her mind was elsewhere, racing through moments from the garden party, the teacup arrangements, Mildred's brief interactions with the guests. She remembered a conversation, barely noted at the time. Lavinia Crowthorne had snapped at Mildred that very morning of the party, something about slowness. And hadn't Mildred responded with a confused apology about the cups? Or was it the sugar? Something small, something buried. After the meeting, Miss Marple walked slowly home, dusk gathering in folds behind her. Foxglove, she thought, a very old poison, a careful one, used with precision. She had once known a girl in St. Mary Mead who'd nearly poisoned her fiancé over a broken engagement with just such a tincture, easy to dose in liquid, slow to detect, difficult to trace unless you knew what to look for. And this second attempt had changed everything. If Elspeth's death had been intentional, and now Mildred had been targeted, it meant the murderer was desperate or frightened. Someone who had once acted from control, now reacting with haste, or perhaps someone was tying up loose ends. The following morning, Sergeant Cornish made his way to the Laurels. Miss Crowthorne greeted him with her usual crispness, but allowed him into the study without protest. I was told your maid has been poisoned, Cornish said directly. Miss Crowthorne blinked, eyes widening. Poisoned? Mildred. She recover. But we believe the method was similar to what killed Mrs. Grant. That makes this case no longer speculative. It's now officially an attempted double homicide. Lavinia sat slowly in her armchair. But why on earth would someone target Mildred? She prepared the tea tray the day Mrs. Grant died, Cornish said quietly. She may have seen something, or handled something meant for another. Miss Crowthorne's lips tightened. If you're suggesting she was the intended victim, I'm suggesting she was either a tool or a witness. Cornish rose. Until we know which, I recommend you review who you allow into your home. And you might think hard about whether anyone else had access to your kitchen that day. That night, word of the second incident spread like lightning through a dry wood at the grocer's. The assistant refused to sell foxglove bulbs to anyone. At the apothecary, Miss Barrington locked up her tincture cabinet and kept the key in her apron. At the Red Hart, the landlord removed all almond essence from behind the bar, just to be safe. And in Miss Marple's parlor, a different kind of conversation unfolded. She sat across from Sylvia Trimble, who had arrived unannounced, pale and jittery. It's not over, is it? Sylvia said without preamble. "Whoever did it, they're still out there." Miss Marple didn't answer at once. Instead, she refilled the teapot with a fresh blend of chamomile. Mrs. Grant, she said, was not the sort to keep secrets quietly. She wrote things down, names, events, and someone clearly feared those pages. Sylvia clutched her handbag. "I didn't do it," she whispered, "but I think I know who did." Miss Marple looked up. "Go on." Sylvia's voice dropped, too. A trembling hush. "I saw Mr. Denholm hand Elspeth a small envelope the week before the party. They were standing outside the greengrocer. She tucked it into her bag without a word. That night I passed her window and saw her crying over it. When she saw me, she shut the curtain. What was in the envelope? I don't know. But the next day she told me there's power in the truth, Miss Trimble, but not everyone wants to see it exercised." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Thank you," she said. "You've told me exactly what I needed to hear." That night, long after Sylvia had gone, Miss Marple returned to her notes. She turned back to the day of the party, to the tray, to the cups dot, then to the journal dot, and there it was on the inside back cover. A faint smudge, not of lipstick or ink, powder, pinkish, bitter. Foxglove could be crushed, dried, hidden in the smallest of folds. Someone had tried to cover their tracks. Someone wasn't done killing yet. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The following Sunday arrived golden and serene, as if nature itself had grown tired of shadows. The bells of St. Bartholomew's rang clearly through the village, their chimes cutting through the uneasy hush that had hovered since the garden party. Villagers filed into the church dressed in their Sabbath best, many more somber than usual. Miss Marple, demure in a powder-blue dress and cream gloves, sat in her usual pew just left of the nave. Her knitting bag unusually sat beside her, though her needles remained untouched. Her eyes, however, remained attentive. She watched the congregation file in. Sylvia Trimble, walking with a book clutched to her chest like a shield. Arthur Denholm, stiff as a granite lion, eyes forward, hands behind his back. And Finlay Leonard, Fielding, shoulders slightly hunched, casting the occasional furtive glance over his shoulder. Each carried something today that had nothing to do with God: fear, guilt, suspicion. And only one had murder on their conscience. Miss Marple wasn't praying. She was watching. After the sermon, she approached Reverend Hargraves. "I wonder if I might borrow the parish hall for a small gathering this afternoon?" she asked lightly. "Nothing grand, just tea and a little conversation. I thought we might try to lift spirits." The Reverend agreed at once. By 4 o'clock, the chairs were arranged in a loose semicircle in the parish hall. A tray of tea and biscuits sat at the center, along with 5 cups and saucers blue rose on cream china, the very same pattern as Lavinia's party set. Miss Marple had sent 3 hand-addressed invitations that morning, and all 3 guests arrived, though none seemed entirely at ease. Arthur Denholm was first, his manner guarded. "What's this all about, Miss Marple?" he asked with a forced smile. "Oh, just tea," she replied cheerfully, "and truth." Next came Leonard Fielding, pale and silent, eyes flicking toward the tray as though it might lurch toward him. And then Sylvia Trimble, looking as if she'd walked into an exam she hadn't prepared for. "Please," Miss Marple gestured, "sit where you like." As they took their seats, She poured each guest a cup of tea. Only once all were seated did she speak again. "You see," she said softly, "I've been thinking a great deal about teacups. Not just which one held poison, but how someone could be sure it would reach the intended lips." Denholm stirred uneasily. "You mean to accuse one of us?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple said gently. "I never accuse, I observe. I notice things. For instance, how a person's hands react when they're near a reminder of what they fear, or how they react when presented with a perfect replica of the scene they helped create." Leonard set down his cup hastily, untouched. Sylvia clutched hers so tightly the saucer rattled. Miss Marple turned her gaze to Denholm. "Do you recall giving Mrs. Grant an envelope shortly before her death?" He blinked. "What?" "I believe it was money, perhaps to keep a secret, perhaps to delay a threat. But money doesn't silence everyone, Mr. Denholm, especially not a woman with little to lose." Denholm rose. "This is outrageous." "Please," Miss Marple said gently. "Sit, or the constable outside may have to help you do so." He hesitated. Sat. "I spoke with Mildred yesterday," she continued, once she regained her senses. She remembered something odd, that her apron, which she'd worn during the garden party, had gone missing the next day. Later it was returned washed, but not by her. She looked at Sylvia now. "Isn't it strange that it had a faint trace of foxglove powder in the pocket?" Sylvia's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Miss Marple turned to Leonard last. "And you, Mr. Fielding, you lied, but not to hide guilt, only shame. You didn't kill Mrs. Grant, but you knew her from before. You feared exposure. And in your fear, you forgot how very still guilt stands compared to panic." Leonard looked down, throat working. "I wanted her to leave," he admitted softly, "but I swear to you I didn't kill her." "I believe you." A long silence followed. Then Miss Marple poured herself a fresh cup and took a slow sip. "I invited you here to watch your hands, your eyes, your breath, because those rarely lie, not the way words do. And today only one person was able to pick up a cup without flinching." She set her cup down with a gentle click. Sylvia. All heads turned to the school teacher, who looked stunned. "I?" she whispered. "No, I didn't. Mildred's apron was missing from your cottage line, Sylvia, folded at the back of the laundry basket. I imagine you took it the evening after the garden party, perhaps to hide the powder you'd spilled. You knew what you were doing. You measured the dose." Sylvia's eyes brimmed with tears. "I didn't mean to kill her," she whispered. Just make her ill, frighten her. She said she'd tell everyone about James. She threatened to ruin everything, my work, my students. She called it leverage, but it was blackmail." She laughed. "Like I was small, insignificant." Her hands trembled now far more than they had when she'd picked up the teacup. "So you used Mildred's apron," Miss Marple said softly, "to carry the powder. And you added just enough to the sugar bowl on the side tray. You didn't pour Elspeth's tea, but you passed the bowl. You knew she always took 2 lumps." Sylvia covered her face. A knock came at the parish hall door. Sergeant Cornish stepped in quietly. Miss Marple nodded once. Cornish approached Sylvia slowly, his voice steady. "Miss Trimble, I'm afraid you'll have to come with me." No one spoke as she rose and walked away, her shoulders shivering under the weight of silence. Only after the door shut did Denholm exhale. Miss Marple turned to him and Leonard with quiet gravity. "We're never quite sure what people are capable of," she said, rising from her seat. "Not until something presses too hard on what they've tried to bury." And with that, she gathered her bag and gloves and left, the tea tray still warm and untouched. Chapter 9. The reveal the following day was quiet in Farnsfield. Not with peace, but with aftermath. Word had spread quickly, though not from the constable's lips. Rather, from Mrs. Pettigrew, who had been near the parish hall when Sylvia Trimble had emerged under escort. By breakfast, the whole village knew that the prim school teacher with the nervous hands had been taken into custody, and that Miss Marple had been involved. The news rippled through drawing-rooms and shops like the sudden cracking of ice across a frozen pond. No one had quite seen it coming, and yet, once it happened, everyone pretended they'd always suspected her. But in truth, very few had. Miss Marple sat that morning in her drawing-room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as Sergeant Cornish took the chair opposite her with a tired expression. "Well," he said at last, "I'll say it plainly, Miss Marple. I'd never have seen it, not in 100 years. She offered him a faint smile. "Most people believe a killer must look like a criminal, but in my experience they usually look like someone's aunt, or schoolmistress, or neighbor." Cornish shook his head. "We nearly arrested Denholm. He had motive, yes, but not opportunity. He never touched the tea. And Mr. Fielding, he was guilty of panic, not of violence. Sylvia, though." Miss Marple's voice turned soft. "Sylvia had motive, she had opportunity, and she had fear. That is the most combustible combination of all." Cornish flipped open his notebook. "And the method, did you tell us, from foxglove? Crushed and added not to the tea, but to the sugar bowl. A clever move. You see, Mrs. Grant took 2 spoonfuls. Others took none or used lemon. Sylvia herself drank tea without sugar habitually, so the risk was minimal. But why not simply poison Elspeth's own cup? Too risky, Miss Marple replied. The cups were uniform. They weren't labeled except by place. Elspeth was standing, mingling. You couldn't guarantee she'd drink from a specific cup, but you could be sure of her habits. She always took sugar. It was how she sweetened her black Darjeeling, 2 lumps, no milk. Cornish nodded, so Sylvia targeted the sugar bowl. Exactly. She wasn't intending to kill at first. She wanted to make Elspeth ill, to frighten her into silence, but foxglove is fickle. The dose was too strong, or perhaps she added too much in a moment of panic. Cornish tapped his pen. And the second attempt? On Mildred? Once the diary was found, Sylvia knew she was in danger. She didn't know whether Mildred had seen her tampering with the tray that day, so she slipped another dose into Mildred's tea, hoping to silence her or at least confuse the timeline. But again, she misjudged the quantity, and this time the attempt failed. Cornish exhaled. It's a tragedy. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly, but not only the death. The real tragedy is how long Sylvia must have lived under the shadow of her brother's mistakes. People will do terrible things to protect a reputation, especially when they believe that reputation is all they have left. There was a long pause between them, then Cornish stood. Thank you, Miss Marple, again. She smiled politely. No thanks needed, Sergeant. I only noticed what others overlooked. That afternoon the parish met for evensong. The pew where Sylvia usually sat remained empty, its absence like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. Arthur Denholm sang louder than usual. Leonard Fielding bowed his head often, eyes fixed to the floor. But Miss Marple, from her seat by the window, watched the way the sunlight streamed through the stained glass and cast soft, flickering colors. Across the nave, she wasn't thinking about poison or diaries or confessions. She was thinking, as she often did, about people. How predictable they could be. How dangerous. How full of contradictions. It was never about the weapon or the opportunity. It was always about why. People, she thought, always reveal more in what they try to hide than in what they say. As the final hymn faded into stillness, she rose and made her way home. Chapter 10. The aftermath. By the end of the week, the roses had begun to bloom again at the Laurels. They were particularly lovely that summer, tall and full-blooded, their crimson petals curling with confidence beneath the sun. Miss Lavinia Crowthorne took this as a sign, though she never said so aloud. There had been a death, yes, and a scandal, but a successful garden party, even one interrupted by murder, must be followed by floral triumph. It was, after all, the Crowthorne way. Farnsfield had begun to settle again. The gossip had lost its feverish pitch, reduced now to quiet recitations like cautionary tales told behind teacups. People still spoke of Elspeth Grant, but with the vague detachment one reserves for those who arrive and leave too quickly to become real. Her cottage, once occupied by curiosity and speculation, now sat empty again, curtains drawn, for sale notice in the window, geraniums still blooming defiantly in the pots outside. Sylvia Trimble had been taken to Bexley jail 2 days after her confession. She would await trial, though her solicitor hinted at diminished responsibility. The term nervous exhaustion had begun circulating. Some said it was a tragic case of emotional collapse. Others said she had always been a little peculiar. Few, however, had truly known her. That, Miss Marple thought, was the point. As for Leonard Fielding, he left Farnsfield soon after. No dramatic departure, no farewell dinner, just a quiet packing of bags and a cab ride to the station. It was said he took a new post in Exeter. A fresh start, though Miss Marple wondered whether the stain of suspicion ever truly faded. Arthur Denholm returned to his business, though with somewhat less pomp. He no longer walked the high street as if it were his own corridor, and his donations to the church resumed, though now with envelopes unsigned. Mildred, the maid, recovered slowly, but returned to her work. She spoke little of her illness, but often brought Miss Marple jars of jam from the Laurels pantry as a thank you, unsure of what exactly she was thanking her for, but certain it was owed. The garden party china was put away in a high cabinet. Miss Crowthorne replaced it with plain white cups. No one minded. One quiet morning, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, with her embroidery in her lap. The windows were open, and the breeze smelled of cut grass and chalk dust. The school having just reopened under the direction of a temporary headmistress from Winchester, she stitched in silence for a long while before reaching for her tea. Outside, a robin sang from the hedge. The village had returned to its rhythm, tidy, predictable, unruffled on the surface. But beneath, as always, the soft movements of secrets still stirred. Miss Marple had learned long ago that crime did not come only in the form of strangers in dark alleys. Often it arrived under the lace of gloves, behind the polite smiles of neighbors, and in the small hesitations of someone passing sugar dot at canine. Human weakness. In fear, in pride, she looked down at her stitching, neat, precise, a small rosebud taking shape at the corner of the cloth, and she thought, not for the first time, how very much life resembled needlework, tiny mistakes covered by clever design, little slips of thread that might unravel the entire piece if only someone took the time to look closely enough. Dot the kettle sang. She poured another cup of tea.